When it comes to Petey's tragic past in Dogman, a lot of attention is given to his abusive father, Crud, who was responsible for pushing Petey toward a life of villainy.
Son?
But did you know that another incredibly important person in Petey's life was his mother, Grace? While Crud left Petey with deep emotional scars, his mother is the source of his happiest memories. Her teachings played a crucial role in his redemption. Even though Lil Petey was the main reason Petey decided to change for the better, that transformation would never have happened without his mother's influence. The reason behind this is that both Grace and Lil Petey were inspired by the same person, Dave Pilkey's mother. After all, Petey himself is based on Pilkey, and his character development is an analogy to the author's own childhood struggles with ADHD and dyslexia. Just like Grace and Lil Petey, Dave Pilkey's mother never gave up on him. She always supported him without judgment. Because of her, Pilkey went from a kid who struggled in school to a world-renowned author and cartoonist, just like Petey went from a feared villain to a kind-hearted soul. If it weren't for his mother, neither Grace nor Lil Petey would have been created. In fact, Pilkey might never have become an author at all, meaning the Dogman series would never have existed. That's why Grace's story is such an essential part of this entire franchise. But there's a lot more to Grace than you might think, and these details could finally come to light in a possible Dogman 2 movie, likely featuring a Petey flashback that introduces her to the cinematic world of our favorite canine cop. Want to learn everything about Grace before anyone else? Get ready to dive in, because another Cinewave is here. Everything we know about Grace starts in the not-so-distant past, sometime in the 80s or 90s. Back then, Crud looked very different. He was rocking the fashion trends of his time, but today that same style would be considered totally outdated. Meanwhile, Grace's appearance has remained fairly consistent over the years. It was during this era that she met Crud, and at some point, he proposed to her, beginning a years-long relationship. Crud was likely in his 20s or 30s at the time, just like Grace. However, it's unclear whether they were close in age or if there was a significant gap between them. One key detail is that the engagement ring Crud gave Grace wasn't just an ordinary ring, it was a powerful artifact known as the Ring of Destiny and stuff, which had been given to him by an alien. The alien's actual mission was for Crud to deliver the ring to Miss Nurse, who was much younger back then, because a prophecy foretold that she would one day save the universe. But in true Crud fashion, he completely ignored that responsibility and selfishly used the ring to propose instead. These events were revealed in Big Jim Begins, the most recent book in the series. After they got married, they lived together for years, but it's unclear how long it took before Grace became pregnant with Petey. It's also hard to determine whether Crud was a terrible husband from the start, or if he only got worse after their son was born. Big Jim Begins establishes that Crud has always been a bad person, but it also proves that he's a massive liar. After all, he shamelessly tricked the alien who trusted him. This means poor Grace may have been deceived multiple times by Crud. In the worst case scenario, she might have been cheated on while believing she was in a perfect marriage, possibly only discovering the truth years later, if she ever found out at all. If you also think Grace deserved better than Crud, drop a hashtag Grace in the comments below. It was only a matter of time after Grace and Crud got married before their love resulted in the birth of Petey, a kitten who could have had a bright future if it weren't for the abuse he suffered at the hands of his father during childhood. The story never goes into detail about exactly how Crud mistreated Petey as a kid, but Petey's reunion with him, both in the book series and in DreamWorks' movie adaptation, gives us a pretty clear idea of what their relationship was like back then. After all, Crud is incredibly lazy, constantly insults his son for no reason, and does everything he can to destroy Petey's self-esteem, all while stealing everything he owns. Imagine what he was like when Petey was just a small child, forced to obey him. And then there's the mystery of Petey's injured tail. Only he and his father know what really happened, but many fans theorize that it was yet another result of Crud's abuse. Because of his toxic relationship with his father, Petey grew up learning not to trust anyone and developed a deep hatred for the world. But Grace's bond with him was completely different. The two loved each other, and she always treated him well, never judging his every action the way Crud did. Even when Petey got frustrated and broke things due to overwhelming stress, Grace forgave him. Instead of punishing him, she tried to teach him how to love, forgive, and be a good person. Even after he became a villain, those lessons, buried deep in his memory, never truly disappeared. Despite being a kind-hearted woman who never hurt anyone, Grace was tragically struck by a severe illness. The exact nature of her condition has never been revealed, but it seemed to be something very serious that required treatment. Possibly leukemia or a lung disease. Either way, one thing is certain, this was the darkest period of Grace's life. And to make matters worse, her own husband abandoned her during this critical time. People often say that spouses should stick together through thick and thin, but Crud clearly didn't care about that. He left her at the worst possible moment. Why? That remains a mystery. Maybe they had a fight right before, or maybe Crud just couldn't handle the responsibility of caring for a sick person. Could he really be that much of a coward? As a result, Grace was left to live alone with Petey. Can you imagine having to raise a child while struggling with a life-threatening illness? That's exactly what she went through, and yet not once did she stop being a loving mother, nor did she ever become selfish, further proving how different she was from Crud. It's heartbreaking to think that Petey's mother ended up married to someone so awful. She truly deserved better. Do you agree? Or do you think we should hear Crud's side of the story first? Crud walking out on Grace during such a difficult time didn't just leave her heartbroken and struggling to raise Petey while battling a serious illness. It also led to another nightmare that every adult dreads: financial ruin. Crud was likely the household's main source of income, and if Grace had a job, her illness must have forced her to stop working. Depending on what kind of job she had, she might not have been eligible for paid leave, or even if she was, those payments are often far from enough to cover living expenses. One way or another, Grace and Petey had no choice but to leave their home and move into a tiny shelter. That's right, as if dealing with a deadly illness and raising a child alone wasn't hard enough, she also lost her home. And this most likely meant she couldn't afford proper treatment for her condition either. If she did have leukemia or some other form of cancer, she would have needed chemotherapy, a treatment that makes people extremely weak before it has a chance to eliminate the tumor. One of the most well-known side effects of chemotherapy is hair loss, but we never see that happening to Grace. This could mean she never even got the chance to undergo the treatment in the first place. Pretty heartbreaking, right? But here's something to cheer you up. Hit that subscribe button. That way, you'll never miss our daily videos about your favorite animated shows and movies.
Thank you.
All these terrible hardships ultimately led Grace to a cruel fate. She didn't survive her illness and passed away, leaving Petey orphaned. This happened sometime after Crud abandoned the family, as Petey was still too young when Grace lost her life. If we put ourselves in Petey's shoes, it's easier to understand how he ended up becoming so bitter and villainous. Grace had left him with many important life lessons, but his pain and sorrow blinded him. Like they say, unacknowledged sadness eventually turns into hatred, and that's exactly what happened to Petey. The worst part? If you really think about it, none of this would have happened if Crud had been a decent husband and father. If he had stayed, Grace and Petey wouldn't have been forced into a shelter. But most importantly, they might have been able to afford proper treatment for Grace's illness. Sure, there's always a chance she wouldn't have survived anyway, but at least Petey wouldn't have felt so abandoned and wronged. On top of that, he would still have had a father, someone to support him through the pain. Even though Grace passed away, her teachings weren't completely lost. That's because after years of being a villain, Petey found someone else in his life who carried the same ideals as his mother, Little Petey, his own son. As we've mentioned before, Little Petey shares the same beliefs as Grace. He probably takes after his grandmother, since he's always believed in the power of love to overcome anything. His kindness and optimism reminded Petey of all the lessons his mother had taught him before she passed, awakening a desire in him to change his ways. One scene in the book, Mothering Heights, illustrates this beautifully. Grace had a beloved ukulele that she cherished, and before she passed, she gave it to Petey as a gift. She had played it for years and was deeply attached to it. But after spending so much time ignoring his mother's lessons, Petey thought he had lost the ukulele forever. However, after his home was destroyed, Lil Petey found the instrument among the wreckage, symbolizing Grace's legacy being recovered after so many years. Want to keep discovering more about the best animated shows today? Then click on one of the 2 videos on your screen. Seriously, you won't regret it. Thanks for watching, and see you next time!